On our program this morning in Hour 1, we'll get into an interesting discussion with a guest who has joined us once previously. Her name is Jacqueline Newman. Jacqueline, in her background, is a family law attorney, managing partner at Berkman, Botker, Newman, and Rod here in the city. She's going to talk with us about a couple of interesting areas of discussion. First of all, Jacqueline, it's nice to talk with you again. Good morning. Welcome to our program. Jacqueline?
Thank you for having me.
Okay. I guess in beginning this discussion, when we talk about this idea of family law, this time of the year, here we are, it's approaching the end of February. Do you see a lot of people coming to you after the holidays?
Yeah, February, they actually call it divorce month. And one of the reasons they do that is because what happens is in January, we get a lot of people that come in initially to kind of get information about divorce because they have just gone through the holidays, and a lot of people obviously don't want to bring up the nasty word of divorce during the holidays and stuff anyone's divorce summons into their stocking. So a lot of people will come in January with the idea that they just want to gather information. And then I find usually around February, is when people start really kind of taking steps forward. They process what they received in January and move forward. And I also find in Valentine's Day, believe it or not, as much of a Hallmark holiday as it may be, a lot of times you'll have a lot of phone calls after that. So that's another time that you really kind of is a big trigger time.
It's almost like a slap of reality at that point for people. When people come to you, and they're basically doing their homework, they're doing their exploring. Listen, it's in the age in which we live, people do their shopping. That's exactly what they're doing. Are there typical questions they come to you with?
Yes. I mean, people generally have big concerns about their children. Mm-hmm. I will find that if I'm talking to the person who's the primary caretaker historically, they'll want to make sure that they continue to be the primary caretaker. And when I'm talking to the person that is not the primary caretaker, they are very, very concerned that they're not going to have a good experience with they're not going to have a good experience with their children, and they're not going to be able to have good access. So those, I would say, are your number one questions. And then, of course, the second questions always have to do with the finances. Okay.
We'll get into the finances in the course of this discussion in a couple of different ways. Because during divorce, I'm assuming one of the issues that can come up is if one of the parties has an inheritance. How is that affected during divorce?
Well, it can be affected in different ways. Part of it depends on whether the person has a prenup or not. Mm-hmm. Initially, just to start as a baseline, inheritances are separate property, meaning that if you receive an inheritance during the marriage, it is going to be that person, the person who received it, it's going to be their separate property. That's kind of your baseline beginning point. It becomes a question as to what that person did with the inheritance to determine whether that inheritance will stay separate property during a divorce proceeding.
What do you mean what they did with it?
So for an example, if somebody had an inheritance and they put it into a joint bank account and they also put the salary they were earning into that same bank account, and then they use all of that money for dinner, vacations, things like that, they're not going to get a credit. It's gone. So that's the beginning part. Now, if there's money that still remains and they've commingled it with any of their marital funds, then it becomes a question of tracing and trying to kind of figure out what money that remains was part of the inheritance or what money was money that was earned. And so that can be a very, very confusing legal argument.
How on earth do they figure that out?
It's not easy. You can bring in, you bring in forensics, you bring in people that really do like a whole background tracing. I mean, sometimes it can be easy. So, for example, if somebody inherited stock, let's say, AT&T stock, and they happen to put it into a brokerage account that had other assets in it, but they never sold that AT&T stock. It stayed exactly the same exact shares. Then that's an easy tracing. It really becomes an issue when someone sells and they buy, and then somebody's actively managing the account. That's when it becomes much more of a challenge.
This idea of the prenup, does everybody need one?
I don't think that everybody needs one. I think there are a lot of people that need them that don't get them. And, once in a while I will say I actually get people that want them, they don't need them. So, but more or less, I think if you have a second marriage, if you actively manage your assets, or if you own a business, I think under those three circumstances, it is an absolute must.
Does it matter the size of the business?
Not really, because, obviously, if it's a really, really small business, maybe not. But the problem, what you're really looking to avoid with a prenup or a postnup, for that matter, is future litigation. So if, in fact, even if the business is not of great value, you don't want to ultimately end up spending more legal fees than the actual value of the business fighting about it in the event of a divorce.
Now, in the situation where somebody inherits property, how does that get affected in divorce proceedings?
When you say property, do you mean actual real estate, or you're
Yes.
just saying in general?
I'm talking about real estate first.
Okay. So in the event that somebody inherits real estate, that actually can be somewhat of a tricky thing. So let's say someone inherits a vacation home. And, the parents in the parties go to the vacation home, the couple that inherited with their children, and they kind of live there, and they go on the summers and things like that. And let's say they renovate that vacation home and they pay taxes on it and things like that. In those circumstances, the real property, the value of it at the time of the inheritance, that would still be separate property. But if there is appreciation due to active efforts by either of the spouses, in that situation, the appreciation could be seen as marital. So that becomes another legal argument that people will get into to decide whether it is just market forces that increased the value of this property, or was it in fact active efforts. And you also have to be sure that if in the event of a divorce, that you make sure you get an appraisal as of the date that you inherited it.
What about a different type of property where it's something, let's say like a rare art collection or some artifacts?
Well, rare art collection, that's a little simpler in most circumstances. So if somebody has, like the typical law school example of this type of thing is that if someone inherits, a piece of artwork and they put it on the wall and they do nothing about it, they dust it every now and again, but other than that, it just stays on the wall. That will generally maintain its separate property character. We say then, let's say if the artist died and all of a sudden it skyrockets. We're going to say unless that person killed the artist, for the most part, they had nothing to do with it, in which case it is a completely passive appreciation, and then it would stay separate.
And in a case like that, do you need to have that appraised as well?
You probably, I wouldn't think that that's going to be as necessary to appraise it for the purposes of keeping it separate. There may be other reasons that people might appraise it just to have a full idea of the value of somebody's estate. But other than that, no, I would say that if it was very clear it was inherited, it was clear that it was inherited and just left to one party, it wasn't left to both of them, and it's literally just been sitting on the wall and you've done nothing for it. The only thing I could see possibly being of issue is if you paid any kind of taxes on it, if you paid any kind of upkeep, if you used your marital income to do anything to basically enhance this asset, maybe you could argue for a credit back to the marital pot, but I think the asset in itself would remain separate.
In terms of documentation, what does one need, the person who's, the party who is receiving this inheritance, what do they need to show that it basically was intended for them? Well,
the will would dictate that.
Okay.
And, I don't think there's usually that much confusion as to who is actually inheriting it. On occasion you will have more. That comes up more so when there's gifts, like when, a wife's family will give a gift to, the couple, and then it becomes an issue of whether they're giving it just to the wife. If they wrote the check to both of them, that's not a good thing to do. But if they wrote it to just their daughter, then that's okay. But in regards to the documentation for an inheritance, really, it's just a question of keeping the paperwork. You don't want to be in a situation, especially what we just talked about with the real property or anything, you don't want to be in a situation where you aren't clear as to the value of what you received. So, and the exact assets of what you received. So, for an example, when we were speaking about the stock, you want to make sure that it's very clear what stock you received. You just want to basically have it neatly lined out exactly what the value of everything you got and everything that you did, in fact, get. And then I would say also be very careful if you do commingle it with any other assets, have the tracing. If you take an asset that you inherit, you inherit some stock, you put it into your brokerage account, keep that statement that showed where it was deposited. And if you move it into another account, keep the next statement that shows where it went. You want to keep in your mind that you may have to prove exactly and show the path of what happened with these assets. And so I would keep all paperwork associated with that.
Okay, I want to follow up on that point when we continue. We're in a good discussion with Jacqueline Newman on our program. She's a family law attorney, managing partner at Berkman, Botker, Newman, and Rod here in the city. And she's sharing with us some insight from her work. Before we pause for our update and some messages, you mentioned about the idea of avoiding commingling inherited money or other assets in accounts. You know, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, if you're doing that, potentially, wouldn't that be something, or couldn't that be something that could spark conflict in a marriage or relationship?
It could. It definitely could. I mean, I think a lot of people, it really depends on how you're going to view the inheritance. So there are, without a prenup or without a postnup or without even a discussion as to how somebody is going to view money inherited from a family in the marriage. There are definitely people that take the position that any money that comes into the marriage, regardless of the source, should be considered marital money. And it's just more of an emotional discussion rather than a legal one. And then there are other people that say, this is my family's money and it's very important to my family that the money stays directly with me. We can use it for the benefit of our marriage, but for the most part, it is my money and I'm going to control it. So I think that that's a really important discussion that people should have just to be on the same page. And no one's right or wrong. It's just a question of everybody understanding how they see it so it doesn't cause the conflict you're speaking of.
I didn't ask you this earlier because you've used a phrase that probably a lot of us have heard. We've heard the term prenup. You've used the term postnup a couple of times. What is that?
A postnup is basically the same idea as a prenup, except for the fact that it's the agreement that you enter in after the marriage.
Okay. Now, when we talk about a situation where, let's say, there's not a prenup agreement in place, should titles be kept, let's say property titles, should they be just in one name?
Well, I can speak for New York. New York is a non-titled state. So in New York, it wouldn't really matter. That said, if somebody inherits something and they don't want to do a postnup and they want to keep things completely separate and not have any issues, I would recommend that they keep it separate, just because if you do put it into joint name, then you're basically opening the door for people to say that it could have been a gift, it could have been this, it could have been that. So it is easier to keep it in single name, but the reason that I bring up the fact about New York is because a lot of people will believe that if they have a bank account that even has the income that they earn and they don't have a postnup sitting in their own name, they think it's their money. And that is always a big shock for people when they walk into my office and I say, even if it's in, your name, just realize that's still a marital account. So I always kind of want to just flag that when I say, yes, keep it in your own name if it's separate. But if something's marital and you put it in your own name, it doesn't necessarily mean that now it's separate.
Jacqueline, yeah, it does make sense. I didn't ask you something at the beginning of our discussion that perhaps I should have in pointing to your background. And I mentioned that you had spoken with us once previously. I don't think I asked you this the time that we spoke before. Practicing this area of law that you do, and you're very experienced in this field, two aspects of this. One, what drew you to it? And secondly, how complex do the laws get?
Okay, well, to answer your first question, it's actually something I had wanted to do always. My parents are both psychotherapists, so the big family joke in my house was that I was too aggressive to be a therapist. So this is something I've actually always wanted to do. I've definitely put all my eggs in one basket, and I've been fortunate enough, the firm that I'm with, my partner, Barry Berkman, was my law school professor. So I've been with the firm for 17 years. I don't even have a resume. It's been the only place I've ever been, and I absolutely love it. I couldn't see myself doing any other kind of law. So I feel very fortunate on that end. And in answer to the complexity, it can become very complex. I mean, part of the problem is the laws change. Well, let's just begin with that. There actually was a huge change in the spousal support law that took place in January 23rd of this year. So laws are always changing. That's one thing. The other thing that I think becomes very complex is, again, we're dealing with families. We're dealing with every situation being somewhat different. So it's hard, to have a hard, fast law is hard because there's a lot of case law, which, just to explain the difference, there's statutes, which are the laws that the legislature makes. And then there's case law, which are, how a judge will interpret those laws for every specific case. And many cases get printed, and that's the other type of law that we will follow. So we will basically read a case and say, is this fact pattern similar to my fact pattern? Can I use what the judge said in this to make arguments in my case?
Mm-hmm.
But it's very hard because, again, every case is different. They're like snowflakes and fingerprints. And so that said, it does get very complex. And then the other thing is, even if it's kind of almost simple from a legal perspective, you have so much emotion that makes every case very, very difficult. But I find it really challenging and I really enjoy it. But yes, the answer is the laws are very complex and it is very, very hard to make cases end easily.
We talked before, and I want to touch upon this now because this ties in, I think, well with where we've talked thus far in our discussion about this idea of the financial abuse that many women suffer in marriage and how it is that they can escape it. I guess, first of all, what is the situation like facing women in terms of financial abuse in marriage?
Well, financial abuse in marriage, sometimes it's not incredibly apparent, and other times it is. But basically what it is when a husband, and just to throw it out there, it's not always against women. I've definitely seen cases also where the woman may be the breadwinner or the person who controls the money, and the husband is in a financial abusive situation. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm just going to say that because more often than not, it is the woman. Basically, it's when they use money to control them. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It's pretty simple. And a lot of times, one of the reasons that it sometimes looks foggy is that it might just be falling down traditional gender lines. You have the husband who goes out and he earns the money, so he controls the money, and the wife is the one who's more in charge of, the house and the children. And so it might not even seem to be a financial abusive situation, and sometimes it's not. The issue to know when it's happening is when the wife in these situations wants to know and be involved in the finances, and the husband says no. And then he basically allots her an allowance or whatever it might be. And that's where I think it keeps her in the financial dark. And that's where it could be an abusive situation. Not always, because again, sometimes, it is the makeup of the marriage. And sometimes people are perfectly happy having one person in charge of one thing, another person in charge of another thing, and everybody staying out of each other's way. And that's fine. But it's when somebody wants to be involved and they're just being shut out. And the reason they're being shut out is for a purpose of control. And that's when it's not a good situation.
How often does that actually occur?
It's hard to know because, again, I think it's hard to know how much it occurs to the hard extreme where it's really an abusive situation, only because, again, sometimes it's just what they know. It's what maybe happened in their families when they were growing up and et cetera, and they don't see it as abusive. And they don't, a lot of women don't even think that they have the right to ask what's going on with the finances. And that's not necessarily the husband's fault. That this is how their mind works. So I don't know if I'd call it an abusive situation because it's not the father. It's not the husband exerting control necessarily because the wife doesn't think to ask. But to answer your question, I don't see cases that are that extreme that often. Maybe a couple a year where it's really just. I had a case once, and this is really to me the quintessential financial abuse situation where the husband was worth, many, many, many millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. And he would have this wife who, was more, raising the children. She definitely played more of that traditional role. And he would have her account for every dime that she spent to the point of school supplies. If she bought pencils for her child, she would have to show him the receipts. In my experience, that would be, I would think, considered financial abuse because he would basically cut her off if he felt that she bought, and I'm not exaggerating when I say too many pencils. It was a terrible, terrible case.
Wow. In situations like that, one would think, well, realistically, outside of divorce, is there any other way to escape from it?
I would push people in those situations into therapy. Because it's not about the money, really. this is about control, this is about power, this is about insecurities. There's a lot more going on, and I think if they were able to kind of discover what's actually really going on in their marriage and why there are issues, then the money is just really a result of it and the way that their relationship with money. So I would encourage people, if this is going on in any type of abusive situation or any type of situation that the communication is just broken down to the point that a person is feeling belittled, they should be in therapy. They should be making efforts to try to get better from it. And if they truly can't, and somebody is in a situation where, their self-esteem and everything else is being, controlled, then maybe divorce is really what they have to be looking at.
And what about those situations where one spouse basically is controlling money, but also is hiding money from the other spouse?
Well, I mean, in a divorce situation, we generally find it. It's actually very hard to hide money. On TV, it looks a lot simpler than it is. So for the most part, in that type of situation, we would find it. And if they're hiding it during the marriage, I mean, odds are the person that is in the financial dark isn't going to know it.
Mm-hmm. You say it's actually hard to hide money?
Yeah, it's not an easy thing. I mean, I say that a little quickly, but unless you're in a high cash business, such as maybe owning a restaurant or, they say dry cleaners and things like that, that could be easier. But for the most part, most people, their money's traceable. I mean, if you are, if you receive a certain amount of money from your business, let's say, or if you're a W-2 employee, and all of a sudden, you're receiving $100,000, but we know you're spending around 20 or 30, and all you show in your bank account is 20 or 30, we know there's a problem. I mean, you can really go back. We can get, in a divorce, we can bring in forensics. That would be people that would really do full tracings. We can basically find most money, unless, again, it's a cash business and this is something that someone's been planning for a really long time, then there could be bigger challenges.
I'd be remiss if I also did not ask you about this case that is coming into the news because, obviously, Bill Cosby has charges against him. He and his wife have been married for 50 years. One of the questions that has come up is, should she file for divorce to protect her assets?
My answer is probably. I mean, the issue that they're going to have is that, I imagine his legal bills are going to be exorbitant. And that's going to be one of the big issues. That's going to, I think, eat away from the financials. Even though if she had nothing to do with this, which I'm going to assume for the purposes of this that she pretty much didn't, I would, at least representing her, I would argue a marital waste argument, and I would say that all of the legal bills and everything associated with this should not come out of her share of the assets.
And how do you do that?
I mean, you basically say that, at this point, I mean, marital waste can come up when you have somebody that is basically spending money on situations that are outside of the marriage, such as possibly drugs, gambling, extramarital affairs, things like that. Now, while I can't say that this would be, necessarily, I wouldn't guarantee this as a successful argument because it does fall a little outside of the scope. But my argument would be in something like this, that, the millions and millions of dollars he's about to spend on legal fees or already has possibly, I don't think that should be something that she should be paying for.
Interesting discussion we're having with Jacqueline Newman on our program. She is a family law attorney, managing partner at Berkman, Botker, Newman, and Rod here in the city, and she's talking with us about a couple of different areas of the field of law that she works in. You mentioned the fact that in January you said there was a huge change in the spousal support law. I wanted to follow up on that. What changed?
Okay, so what happened is that before this law, all we had was a formula for determining what was called interim support. So interim support would be from the time that you start a divorce action up until the time that there's an action on the divorce. So there was a formula for that. That actually didn't before, just to give you a little bit of history, in 2010 when New York became a no-fault state, before that we had no formula at all to determine spousal support and maintenance. So in that time, basically you would look at somebody's budget and then you would look at what someone could afford to pay, and then you would just kind of have to do a whole analysis for it. And courts said, that was a lot of litigation because people were arguing about somebody's budget. They were arguing about what they could pay because all of that's a little subjective. So basically the court said, okay, in 2010 they put together this at least temporary formula, which was great. So we had a formula, and we were able to kind of go into court and be able to say, these are the numbers, and they would just plug it into the formula, and more or less with a lot of caveats, because there were a lot of ways you could argue around the formula, but more or less you had a straightforward way to deal with this. However, after the divorce, you were back to the point that you were before in the fact of understanding what someone's support should be to be able to figure out what someone should be receiving in support after the divorce. So now, in January 23rd, the courts, the legislature has now put in a formula for the pre-divorce and post-divorce formulas, maintenance calculations. So it is helpful. There are a lot of issues with it just from using it in practice, but the idea that at least there is a formula, there's some guidelines for us to work by, that is helpful. But there's been a big shift because now we do have something to work with that we never had before.
Why was it that New York became, as you referred to it, as a no-fault state?
Well, New York was one of the last ones to become a no-fault state. So prior to 2010, we had to prove grounds in order to get divorced. So somebody couldn't just say, I want to get divorced. They had to either claim it be, adultery. They had to claim it to be abuse. They had to claim it to be constructive abandonment, which meant you didn't have sex for the last year, despite the fact that somebody had asked you to. So you had to basically, in a lot of situations, people just fell out of love. They just wanted to get divorced, but you still had to draft some sort of verified complaint listing all of these different reasons why you got divorced, and courts could reject them. I've had a few cases where they just didn't feel that the grounds were enough. And so you almost had to, think of more things to say that were terrible about your other spouse. And all you really wanted to do is say, you know what, we're not right for each other, but I don't want to badmouth you. It was a terrible thing. And a lot of people would move to New Jersey or Connecticut because they just wanted to avoid having to go through a grounds trial.
And what did that do? What has that done to the volume of cases and also, I guess, the pace with which cases move through the courts in New York?
From a volume perspective, it actually hasn't been, it's not as if, I think people did have a fear that now all of a sudden it was going to be quote unquote easy and therefore people were going to come running to the courts. And it really didn't happen. People were still able to get divorced. They would just have to go through more. So what it did happen, it obviously was a little less work for attorneys, which is perfectly fine because this type of, fighting for these type of things was a terrible thing to do anyway. But yeah, it didn't speed things up necessarily either. Because more often than not, from a practical standpoint, people would agree to grounds. People would do constructive abandonment just because, as we'd say, no one's in your bedroom, so nobody knows what's going on. That was what people, I would say, did more often than not. And now it's like they just didn't have to write that type of embarrassing things about each other, in a legal document. So it didn't, and it doesn't necessarily speed things up because, unfortunately, what also was going on is that there have been great budget cuts in the courts, and so it takes a very long time to get divorced, basically just to move the papers through because of the fact that they're so understaffed.
Okay, just back for a moment to this Bill Cosby case, and obviously I need to state the fact that there are just charges against him. He's not convicted of anything. Right. In terms of a formal court of law. But with the high-profile nature of the sexual assault case as well as the sexual assault allegations or accusations against him, what impact could that have or will that have on a potential divorce proceeding if his wife chose to go that way? It could have, I think that one of the biggest issues that would come up, the actual sexual assault elements or accusations, as we're saying, I don't know if that will have as much of an impact as people would think it would. Based on the fact that, assuming that he doesn't go to jail and assuming that this becomes just really more of a financial element, which it looks like that's what's going to happen, then I would say that only to the degree that there will be, if she cannot argue successfully that the marital waste and that really any monies that are paid out to any of these alleged victims and if any legal fees, if she argues successfully that money should come off of his side of the ledger, then I don't think this is going to have a great impact on any divorce proceeding. If she can't argue that successfully and a court basically says, no, these are marital debts, then, whatever that expense is going to be is going to come off right off the top of the marital pot. And if they were involved in a high-profile and very public divorce, could damaging evidence from that be used in his other legal battles?
Um, Possibly. I'm trying to, I don't think this is going to be as sexy as people think it's going to be from the divorce perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know what really would be coming out unless she knew, unless she got him, allegedly got him the drugs that allegedly he used on these women. I just don't think that they're really going to be as intermingled as people would think that it would be. I think that if she gets divorced, my guess is that if she does a divorce, she's not going to do it in a high-profile way. She's probably going to do mediation or collaborative law or something that's going to keep it under the radar. Because my understanding of her, not knowing her personally, is that she's not looking to air any dirty laundry in the public, especially being that so much of it is getting aired anyway. I mean, they have children. She seems to be, a classy person that really wants to kind of keep her family secrets as secret as they can be.
Let's move on to social media, because this is such a huge part of people's lives. When we talk about divorce, how big a factor is social media becoming in divorce?
Every day it's becoming more and more. And I am a big advocate of telling my clients to stay away from social media. Nothing good can come from it, and only bad things can come from it. And people, are so quick to type these little posts out and do, little texts and, Twitter and everything. And it's like they're just putting everything out in the public. And, what I tell people is if you're comfortable with whatever you write, me handing that to a judge, then definitely do it. If not, I tell people just stay away. I joke and I say get mittens so you cannot type anything and stay away from all of it. But unfortunately, people are hurt and they're going through hard times, and a lot of people feel a lot of comfort with social media, and so they do not always follow my advice.
So you're telling people no Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram?
I mean, for the most part, they don't have to be crazy about it, but they should not be talking about their divorce. They shouldn't be saying things about their children that can in any way be used against them in their divorce. I mean, if they want to talk about, a great turkey sandwich they had, or if they want to talk about recipes, or if they want to talk about, what their visions of the stock market, I don't care about that stuff. But I do care when they start saying anything bad about their spouse. I care when they talk about their children. And I care when they talk, what happens a lot is that, you'll have somebody who will brag about some great deal they just closed, or some new great vacation they're going on, or a new car they just bought. And, they're making those arguments at the same time they're saying they can't afford to pay for child support. They can't pay, and so that's where it could be an issue.
That would seem to be a bit of a conflict, to say the least.
Yes.
The reality of the impact of social media, how often, I guess, do you see this being used when it comes to, let's say, custody cases?
I mean, it definitely is coming up, because what will happen is a lot of times people will post something. There was actually, I don't know if you remember Bethany Frankel, who, she had posted a picture of her wearing her daughter's pajamas or something like that. And, I'm sure she thought she was being funny, but I can tell you that the judge was thoroughly offended by it. And it's one of those things that, do I think she meant harm by it? Probably not. But I can tell you that, the judge that they were working on was not happy and found it to be inappropriate. And, it's just one of those things. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't a smart thing to do. I know Madonna just had issues in the fact that she was posting, and making kind of jokes at her son over social media, which I'm sure, if she was doing it over the kitchen table, that would be fine. But the fact that she was doing it in front of her, millions and millions of followers, it was very upsetting to him. And I just don't think that people recognize that when they put something out there, how other people are going to interpret it. I think they look at it just as the way they're interpreting it and what their intent was. But anytime, you say that even with an email, it's like you can't get necessarily the full message when you're typing something on a computer.
Why is it that people just don't seem to get that? I mean, I can understand to some extent, and I don't want to sound like I'm Methuselah here and I'm a million years old, but people who are younger, they're in perhaps their 20s or early 30s, maybe they're not as aware, but there's a lot of people who are a lot older than that who one would think should know better.
I tend to agree. And, when I've told people to stop going on social media, clients, and I've said what seems very obvious to me, they look like I'm chopping off their left arm. I mean, I think that people are very addicted. I think that there's this immediate gratification that people get. I think people feel part of a community when they're, posting these type of things. And people also, I think there's also this element of not knowing who's seeing it. So it almost feels like you talk about how you can speak more openly to a stranger than to your best friend. And there is, I think, that element of that. And when people are going through a divorce, it happens almost more because they just feel they want to be understood. And I'm sure if they're posting something out to their 10,000 followers, someone's going to understand them, and someone's going to give them that connection and that, validity. But it's not worth it. It's just not a smart thing to do. But, people get caught in the moment. They're not thinking big term and they're not thinking big picture. And it's a problem. I mean, it's definitely something that, again, I encourage people over and over again, please do not go on social media and do this because, it's an electric footprint. It's not going anywhere. And, courts will see it and it will be twisted and people will, just basically use it against you. And, is that really worth it for the 2 minutes of satisfaction that you got?
With the pace of everything being so increased because of this access to information, do you feel that because of social media today that divorces are tending to happen faster than they did in the past?
I think they are. I think that a lot of things are happening. I mean, one of the things that people are connecting with people from their past in a way that they weren't able to before. And I think that there's a lot of voyeurism. People are looking at other people's lives, and I think they're, we always say, like, Facebook happy. I mean, very rarely do you see a post where their child is screaming hysterically in a mall. No, instead you see the happy pictures. And so everybody thinks that everybody else's lives are so perfect and their marriages are so perfect. So I think it makes people more angry at their own. And I think that what's also going on is that people are connecting in a way that they didn't. Oddly enough, they're not connecting in a certain way, but they are connecting in another way where, if you had, and again, I'm being a little stereotypical, but if you had somebody who is a stay-at-home mom who kind of felt isolated in her own world and just kind of thought that, what she was going through was normal and, but not knowing that maybe it's not normal. And when they're able to go on social media and see other people that are saying, no, this isn't a good thing, and, your husband shouldn't be doing this, or whatever it might be, even the financial abuse that we spoke about before, people might not even know what's happening. And then when you start, you start writing things out to other people, and especially, there's so many groups and things like that, they start to see that this isn't okay, and I think that is leading to a lot more divorces. I think people are just realizing, that more people are dissatisfied in their marriages than they thought they were.
And are there cases where a person will use, because they, sometimes people know their ex's passwords, they'll get access to that person's profile, and potentially I would think that could have ramifications back for the person who does that.
Yes, I would recommend people do not do that.
Have you known people who have done that?
Yes, I have, and I recommend to them that they do not do it.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, why would somebody even think of doing something like that? I just fail to understand that.
The one thing I say is that when someone told me this saying once, and I think it's very appropriate for people divorcing, they say, divorce law and criminal law are very similar. In criminal law, you have bad people on their best behavior, and in divorce, you have good people on their worst behavior. So I think that kind of answers why a lot of people do some of the things that I'm sure they would not be doing if they weren't going through such a stressful time in their lives.
Does divorce have to be acrimonial?
No, it absolutely doesn't. And, one of the things that I'm very proud with my firm specifically is that we offer mediation and collaborative law as alternatives to litigation. We do litigate as well, but I want people to know that there are options, and you don't have to be having this drag-out fight in court that you see on TV. There are a lot of different ways to do it. And I would say the majority of our cases do settle outside of court.
Our guest is Jacqueline Newman. Her voice has been with us in this hour of our program. She is a family law attorney, managing partner at Berkman, Botker, Newman, and Rod here in the city. You've shared an awful lot with us in this discussion. Obviously, you have a great deal of enjoyment with the work that you do as well, Jacqueline. Thank you very much for providing us with some insights on exactly some of the things that are happening in the field in which you work.
Thank you so much for having me.